The air is thick with dust and the metallic tang of blood. It is May 29th, 1453, and the world is ending. For 1,000 years, the walls of Constantinople have been the shield of Christendom, the unbreakable barrier between two worlds. Now they are dust. Through a breach carved by monstrous cannons, the elite janissaries of the Ottoman Sultan pour into the city. The screams of the dying are a chorus to the roar of conquest. At the heart of the chaos stands one man, stripped of his imperial purple, clad only in the armor of a common soldier. He is Constantine the 11th, the last emperor of the Romans. He sees the tide of history turning against him, against his city, against his entire civilization. And in this final, desperate moment, he makes a choice. He raises his sword, utters a final prayer, and charges into the sea of his enemies, disappearing into legend. How did it come to this? How could an empire that survived the fall of Rome, that outlasted Goths, Huns, Persians, and Arabs, that stood for a millennium as the wealthiest, most sophisticated city on earth, be reduced to this single, hopeless charge? This is not a story of a sudden collapse. It is the story of a thousand-year-long fight for survival. It is a story of impossible resilience, of secret weapons and brilliant diplomacy, of catastrophic betrayals and the inexorable march of technology. To understand the fall of Constantinople, we must first understand the secret of its incredible life. We must journey back to a time when the dream of Rome was not yet a memory, but a future waiting to be built. For this is the story of the Second Rome, the city that carried the torch of civilization through 1,000 years of darkness, the empire that we call Byzantine. It begins, as all great stories do, with a vision. In the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was a fractured giant, groaning under the weight of its own immensity. Its old heart, the city of Rome, was a place of political decay and logistical nightmares. The Emperor Constantine the Great knew that to save the empire, he had to give it a new center of gravity, a new heart. His gaze fell upon a little Greek trading town called Byzantium. At first glance, it was unremarkable, but Constantine saw what others did not. He saw a peninsula of rock, a natural fortress guarded by the sea on 3 sides. He saw a deep, sheltered harbor, the Golden Horn, that could protect a fleet. Most importantly, he saw the crossroads of the world. Here, the continents of Europe and Asia nearly touched, separated only by the glittering ribbon of the Bosphorus Strait. All trade, all armies, all ideas moving between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between the East and the West, had to pass through this single, controllable point. It was a place of destiny. In 330 AD, Constantine consecrated his city as Nova Roma, the New Rome, but it would forever be known by his name, Constantinople. It was built to be the capital of a Christian empire, a rejection of old Rome's pagan past. Palaces of marble, forums larger than any in the old city, and churches that scraped the heavens rose from the ground. Its streets were a sensory explosion. The scent of spices from the distant east, cinnamon, clove, and pepper, mingled with the salt of the sea and the incense pouring from 100 churches. In the markets, you could hear every language spoken under the sun, from the Latin of soldiers and administrators to the Greek of scholars, the Syriac of merchants, and the strange, guttural tongues of barbarian mercenaries. This was not just a city, it was the world in miniature, the hub of a global network of trade and power that made it fabulously, almost mythically, wealthy. While the western half of the Roman Empire would crumble under the pressure of barbarian invasions, finally collapsing in 476, the East endured. It held on, centered on its magnificent, unbreachable capital. They never called themselves Byzantines. To the very end, they were the Romioi, they were Romans, and their city was the heart of the Roman Empire. This simple fact, this continuity of identity and power, would shape the next 1,000 years of history. Before we witness its final, tragic hours, we must first understand the pillars that held this incredible structure aloft for a millennium. We must meet the men and women who shaped its destiny, beginning with an emperor who dreamed of rebuilding the past, a man whose ambition was as vast and brilliant as the empire he ruled, but whose reign would inadvertently plant the seeds of its future struggles. His name was Justinian. The year is 527. On the throne of Constantinople sits a man of restless energy and boundless ambition, Flavius Petrus Sabatius Aestinianus. Justinian, he was not born to the purple, he was a peasant from the Balkans who rose through the ranks on sheer merit and the influence of his uncle, the previous emperor. This outsider's perspective gave him a burning desire to prove his legitimacy, to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. He looked west, to the lands lost to the Goths, the Vandals, and the Franks, and saw not fallen provinces, but Roman land waiting to be reclaimed. He was a man who thought in terms of centuries, who saw himself as a successor not just to Constantine, but to Augustus and Trajan. His court was a dazzling reflection of this ambition, a place of rigid ceremony and intellectual fire. The air in the great palace hummed with the work of architects, theologians, and lawyers, all driven by the emperor's relentless will. But Justinian was not alone in his ambition. Beside him sat one of the most remarkable women in history, the Empress Theodora. A former actress and courtesan, a profession considered scandalous and lowly, she possessed an iron will and a political mind as sharp as any in the empire. She was Justinian's partner in every sense, his most trusted advisor, his co-ruler. While Justinian dreamed of reconquest and legal reform, Theodora was the master of the palace's internal politics, a protector of the common people, and the anchor that would hold the empire together in its darkest hour. Justinian's first great project was not one of conquest, but of order. The laws of Rome were a chaotic jungle of decrees, rulings, and opinions accumulated over 1,000 years. Justinian assembled the greatest legal minds of the age and tasked them with a monumental work, to codify it all. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Code of Justinian. It was a masterpiece of legal clarity and a testament to the enduring power of Roman administration. This collection of laws would not only govern the Byzantine Empire for the next 900 years, but would also become the bedrock of civil law for countless nations in the modern world. Every time a contract is signed in France, or a legal dispute is settled in Germany, a faint echo of Justinian's ambition can be heard. With his laws in order, Justinian turned his gaze outward. He found his instrument of conquest in a general of sublime talent, Belisarius. A man of quiet charisma and tactical genius, Belisarius was the perfect commander to realize Justinian's grand design. In 533, he led a small expeditionary force to North Africa, a land held by the Vandals for a century. In a lightning campaign, he shattered the Vandal kingdom and restored the province to Roman rule. The victory was stunning, and the treasures of Africa flowed back to Constantinople. Next, Belisarius turned to Italy, the very heartland of the old empire, now ruled by the Ostrogoths. This war would be different. It would be a long, brutal 20-year slog that would bleed both Italy and the empire dry. He took Sicily, Naples, and finally the ancient city of Rome itself. For a fleeting moment, it seemed Justinian's dream was within reach. The Mediterranean was once again becoming a Roman lake. But even as Belisarius fought in Italy, a crisis was brewing back home. A firestorm that would threaten to consume Justinian, his throne, and his entire city. It erupted not from a foreign enemy but from the heart of Constantinople itself, the Hippodrome. The great chariot racing stadium was the city's pressure valve, a place where the passions of the populace, divided into the blue and green factions, could be unleashed. In January of 532, these rival factions, united in their hatred of Justinian's high taxes and authoritarian rule, exploded in a frenzy of violence. The Nika riots, named for their chant of Nika, meaning conquer, engulfed the city. Mobs burned buildings, lynched officials, and declared a new emperor. For 5 days, Constantinople was a vision of hell. Justinian, barricaded in his palace, lost his nerve. He prepared to flee, to abandon his city and his dream. It was Theodora who saved him. In a moment of supreme courage, she stood before the terrified emperor and his council and delivered a speech that would change history. "It is impossible for a person, having been born into this world, not to die," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "But for one who has reigned, to be a fugitive is unbearable. I will not flee, I will stay. Royal purple is the noblest shroud." Her words were like a steel spine inserted into the wavering court. Shamed and inspired, Justinian and his generals resolved to fight. Belisarius, recalled from the frontiers, led his troops into the Hippodrome and cornered the rebels. The massacre that followed was horrific. 30,000 people were slaughtered, the rebellion was crushed, but the city lay in ruins. Justinian's authority was secure, but it was an authority baptized in blood. From the ashes of the Nika riots, Justinian would begin his most famous project, the rebuilding of the city's main cathedral, the Hagia Sophia. It would be a statement of power and faith, a wonder of the world, its dome so vast it seemed to hang from heaven by a golden chain. Justinian's reign was a paradox. He had reconquered vast territories, codified the law, and built monuments for the ages. On the surface, the empire looked stronger than it had in centuries, but the foundations were cracking. The long wars in Italy and against the Persian Empire in the east had been ruinously expensive, emptying the treasury that his predecessors had so carefully filled. The high taxes needed to fund these wars bred resentment among his people. The empire was overstretched, its armies spread thin across a vast frontier. And then, as if sent by a wrathful god, a new, invisible enemy arrived. It came from the south, from Egypt, traveling on the grain ships that fed the capital. It was a pestilence of unimaginable horror. In 541, the plague of Justinian erupted. It was the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, a ghost of the Black Death that would ravage Europe centuries later. The contemporary historian Procopius, an eyewitness, described its terrifying progress. Victims were seized by a sudden fever, then developed the telltale buboes, swelling lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and behind the ears. Some fell into a deep coma, others were driven mad with delirium and pain. In Constantinople, the death toll was catastrophic. At its peak, 10,000 people were dying every single day. The city ran out of burial space. Bodies were dumped in the sea or stacked in the towers of the city walls. The stench of death hung over the magnificent capital like a shroud. The emperor himself was stricken, and though he would eventually recover, the empire would not. The plague scythed through the population, killing perhaps a third of the empire's inhabitants. The economy collapsed. Farms lay fallow, trade ground to a halt, and the tax base evaporated. The army was decimated, making it impossible to hold the newly conquered lands in the west. Belisarius's hard-won victories in Italy crumbled away. The dream of a restored Roman Empire died in the plague pits of Constantinople. Justinian would rule for another 2 decades, a grim, isolated figure in his great palace, but the Golden Age was over. He left behind an empire that was geographically larger but financially bankrupt, militarily exhausted, and demographically shattered. The stage was set for a new chapter in the empire's story, a desperate struggle for survival against a new and formidable foe that would emerge from the deserts of Arabia, a foe that would test the very foundations of the Byzantine world. In the century after Justinian's death, the empire was a ship navigating a perfect storm. It was locked in a titanic, generation-spanning struggle with its ancient rival, the Sassanid Persian Empire. This was not a series of border skirmishes, it was a war for total annihilation. The Persians conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, capturing the holy city of Jerusalem and carrying off its most sacred relic, the true cross. At one point, their armies stood on the shores of the Bosphorus, looking across the water at the domes of Constantinople itself. The empire was on the brink of extinction. It was saved by the heroic efforts of Emperor Heraclius, who in a series of brilliant campaigns rolled back the Persian tide and reclaimed the lost provinces. In 628, the war ended with a total Byzantine victory. The true cross was returned to Jerusalem in triumph. It seemed as though the Roman order had been restored. But this victory was a mirage. Both empires were utterly exhausted, their manpower and treasuries spent. They were 2 aging gladiators who had battered each other into a state of near collapse, and it was at this precise moment of weakness that a new force erupted from the Arabian Peninsula, a force unlike any the world had ever seen. United by the new faith of Islam, Arab armies fired with religious zeal and tactical brilliance exploded across the Middle East. They were fast, they were motivated, and they were unstoppable. They faced Byzantine and Persian armies that were battle-weary and depleted. The result was a geopolitical earthquake. The Sassanid Empire was wiped from the face of the earth. The Byzantine Empire was dealt a series of hammer blows from which it would never fully recover. Syria, the Levant, and the holy city of Jerusalem, so recently won back from the Persians, were lost again, this time for good. Then came Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, the source of Constantinople's grain. And then North Africa, Justinian's first great reconquest. In the space of a single generation, the empire was stripped of more than half its territory and its wealthiest provinces. It was transformed from a sprawling Mediterranean empire into a much smaller, more compact state, essentially reduced to Anatolia, the Balkans, and parts of Italy. The crisis was existential. The Arab Caliphate, now a mighty empire stretching from Spain to India, was not content with its conquests. In 674, a massive Arab fleet sailed through the Dardanelles and laid siege to the city. For 4 years, they blockaded the capital, launching repeated attacks. The survival of what was left of the Roman world hung in the balance. The city held, its massive walls proving their worth, but the key to victory lay not on the land but on the sea. And it was here that the Byzantines unleashed their greatest secret, a weapon so terrifying and effective that it would be talked about in hushed, fearful tones for centuries. They called it sea fire or liquid fire. We know it as Greek fire. Imagine you are an Arab sailor in the fleet blockading the city. You see small, fast Byzantine ships called dramans bearing down on you. From a bronze tube mounted on the prow of one of these ships, a stream of liquid fire erupts with a deafening roar. It strikes your wooden vessel and the world turns to hell. The fire is like nothing you have ever seen. It clings to wood, to sails, to men. Water cannot extinguish it. In fact, it seems to burn even more fiercely on the waves. It is a vision of damnation, a weapon of pure terror. The Arab fleet, facing this horrific new technology, was burned, shattered, and ultimately forced to withdraw. The formula for Greek fire was one of the most closely guarded state secrets in history, passed down from emperor to emperor. Its exact composition is still debated by historians, but it was likely a petroleum-based mixture, possibly containing naphtha, sulfur, and quicklime, pressurized and projected through a siphon. It was, in effect, a medieval flamethrower. It was a technological game-changer that secured Byzantine naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. But the Arabs were not deterred. In 717, they returned with an even larger force, an immense armada and an army of over 100,000 men. The Second Arab Siege of Constantinople was one of the great turning points in world history. The city was blockaded by land and sea, cut off from all supplies. As a brutal winter set in, the defenders, led by the brilliant Emperor Leo III, began to starve. The fate of Europe arguably rested on the shoulders of this one city. Had it fallen, the path into the Balkans and beyond would have been wide open for the Umayyad Caliphate. But once again, the city's defenses held. The Theodosian walls were impregnable, and on the water, Greek fire did its hellish work. The Arab fleet was annihilated. The land army, ravaged by starvation, disease, and Bulgarian attacks from the rear, was forced into a disastrous retreat. The victory was total. The tide of Islamic expansion into Europe from the east was broken. Constantinople had saved itself, and in doing so had shielded the developing kingdoms of medieval Europe. The empire had survived its gravest test, but it was a changed world. The age of imperial restoration was over. The long, brutal, and often lonely struggle for survival had begun. For the next 3 centuries, the Byzantine Empire settled into a long, grinding war with the Caliphate along a frontier that snaked across the mountains of eastern Anatolia. This was a world of constant raiding and counter-raiding, of spies and betrayals, of fortresses built and fortresses lost. The empire, smaller and poorer, had to adapt to survive. It reorganized itself for total war, creating the theme system. Provinces were turned into military districts, each commanded by a general, the strategos. In place of a salaried professional army, soldiers were granted plots of land in exchange for military service. This created a loyal, self-sufficient force of citizen soldiers with a direct stake in defending their homes. It was a brilliant innovation that provided the empire with the resilience it needed to endure centuries of warfare. Slowly, painstakingly, the empire clawed its way back. The 9th and 10th centuries saw the rise of the Macedonian dynasty, a line of tough, competent soldier emperors who began to push back. This period is often called the Macedonian Renaissance, a time of military resurgence and cultural flowering. And it reached its zenith under one of the most formidable and ruthless emperors in Byzantine history, Basil II. Basil reigned for nearly 50 years, from 976 to 1025. He was a man utterly devoted to the state, a soldier who spent almost his entire adult life in the saddle campaigning on the frontiers. He was austere, pious, and utterly merciless to his enemies. He had no time for the luxuries of the court, preferring the harsh life of the military camp. His primary obsession was the destruction of the empire's great rival in the Balkans, the Bulgarian Empire. For decades, he waged a relentless war of attrition against them. The climax came in 1014 at the Battle of Cladion. Basil won a decisive victory, capturing 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. What he did next earned him his terrifying epithet. He ordered all the prisoners to be blinded. He left only one man in every 100 with a single eye so that they could lead their comrades back to the Bulgarian Tsar. The story goes that when the Tsar saw his mutilated army stumbling back into his capital, he died of a heart attack. By 1018, the Bulgarian Empire was completely annexed. Basil II was known forever after as Balgariktonos, the Bulgar Slayer. When he died, he left the empire at its largest and wealthiest since the days of Justinian. The treasury was overflowing and the frontiers were secure from the Danube to Syria. It seemed as though the Roman eagle was flying high once more. But this strength was brittle. Basil's system depended on a strong, centralizing emperor. His successors were weaker men, more interested in courtly pleasures than military discipline. The powerful landed aristocracy, whom Basil had ruthlessly suppressed, began to reassert their influence. They bought up the small farms of the soldier peasants, undermining the very foundation of the theme system. The army was increasingly privatized, loyal to powerful generals rather than the emperor. The state began to rely more and more on foreign mercenaries, Normans, Vikings, and Turkic horsemen from the steppes. These soldiers were effective, but they were expensive and their loyalty was always for sale. Cracks were appearing in the magnificent facade of the empire. And to the east, a new power was rising. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people who had converted to Islam and carved out a vast empire in Persia and Central Asia, were pushing west. Their raiding parties, the Ghazis, began to probe the Byzantine frontier in Anatolia. In 1071, the Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes decided to meet this threat head-on. He gathered a massive army, a mixture of native Byzantine troops and foreign mercenaries, and marched east. Near the town of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, he met the Seljuk army under their charismatic Sultan Alp Arslan. The Battle of Manzikert was not a simple military defeat, it was a catastrophe born of betrayal and incompetence. The Byzantine army was a patchwork of rival factions. On the evening of the battle, as Romanos attempted a tactical withdrawal, one of his commanders, Andronikos Doukas, a political rival, deliberately spread the rumor that the emperor had fallen. He then marched his entire rearguard off the field. The rest of the army panicked. The Seljuks, seeing the chaos, turned and attacked. The Byzantine force was annihilated. And for the first time in nearly 7 centuries of Roman history, an emperor was captured in battle by a foreign enemy. The defeat itself was bad enough, but its consequences were apocalyptic. With the emperor a captive and the army destroyed, civil war erupted back in Constantinople. There was no one left to defend the frontier. The Seljuk Turks, who at first had only intended to raid, now poured into Anatolia. The entire peninsula, the agricultural and demographic heartland of the empire, was lost in a single decade. The theme system collapsed completely. The empire was gutted. It was from this moment of near death that a new dynasty, the Komnenoi, would emerge. Their first emperor, a brilliant general and an even more brilliant diplomat named Alexios Komnenos, would stabilize the situation. But he would do so by making a fateful decision, a desperate appeal for help that would change the world forever. He would turn to the west. He would unleash the Crusades. Alexios Komnenos took the throne in 1081 in a world on fire. The empire was a hollowed-out shell. To the north, nomadic Pecheneg horsemen raided up to the very walls of Constantinople. To the west, Norman adventurers from Sicily, led by the fearsome Robert Guiscard, had conquered the last Byzantine territories in Italy and were now invading the Balkans. And to the east, the Seljuk Turks occupied all of Anatolia, which they now called the Sultanate of Rum, the Sultanate of Rome. The imperial treasury was empty. The army was a collection of unreliable mercenaries. It was the gravest crisis since the Arab sieges. Alexios was a master of survival. Through cunning diplomacy and sheer grit, he played his enemies against each other, bribing one to fight another. He stabilized the currency, rebuilt the army, and slowly began to push the invaders back. But he knew he could not reconquer Anatolia alone. He needed elite, heavy cavalry, the kind of knights that were becoming the dominant force on the battlefields of Western Europe. In 1095, he sent envoys to Pope Urban II with a carefully worded request. He asked for a small contingent of Western mercenaries to help him fight the Turks. He likely imagined a few hundred, perhaps a few thousand professional soldiers who would fight for his gold and under his command. What he got was something else entirely. Pope Urban, seeing a golden opportunity to assert papal authority, heal the growing rift between the Eastern and Western churches, and redirect the violent energies of Europe's knights, preached a sermon that set the world alight. He called not for a mercenary expedition, but for a holy war, an armed pilgrimage to liberate the holy city of Jerusalem from Muslim rule. He promised forgiveness of sins for all who took up the cross. The response was overwhelming, far beyond anything Alexios or the Pope could have imagined. Tens of thousands of people, from great lords to common peasants, answered the call. The First Crusade was born. When the Crusaders began to arrive at Constantinople, Alexios was horrified. This was not the disciplined military force he had asked for. It was a chaotic, fractious, and pious mob, led by ambitious warlords who had carved out their own kingdoms in Europe and clearly intended to do the same in the East. They were powerful, they were unpredictable, and they were right outside his gates. Alexios handled the situation with masterful diplomacy. He welcomed the Crusader leaders, flattered them, bribed them, and extracted from them a solemn oath. Any former Byzantine lands they reconquered from the Turks would be returned to his authority. Reluctantly, they agreed. The First Crusade was, against all odds, a startling success. The combined force of Crusaders and Byzantines defeated the Seljuks and reconquered much of western Anatolia, restoring a vital part of the empire's heartland. The Crusaders then marched south, capturing Antioch and in 1099 the city of Jerusalem in a bloody assault. But they did not return these lands to the emperor. Instead, they established their own independent Crusader states. The deal was broken. The seeds of mistrust and resentment between the Latin West and the Greek East were sown. For the next century, this relationship would be a toxic mix of cautious alliance and simmering hostility. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as crude, greedy, and untrustworthy barbarians. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as effeminate, treacherous, and heretical schismatics. This simmering hostility boiled over in 1204. The Fourth Crusade was an expedition that went disastrously, catastrophically wrong. Originally intended to attack Egypt, the Crusaders, led by ambitious Venetian and French nobles, found themselves short of funds. The shrewd, blind old Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, who held a deep-seated grudge against the Byzantines, saw an opportunity. He diverted the crusade to Constantinople, using a disputed imperial succession as a pretext. The Crusaders agreed to help a young claimant to the throne, Alexios Angelos, in exchange for a massive payment and promises of church unity. They placed him on the throne, but the new emperor could not pay what he had promised. Tensions in the city exploded. The Crusaders, encamped outside the walls and feeling betrayed, made a decision that would forever stain the name of their cause. They decided to take their payment by force. In April 1204, the armies of the Fourth Crusade, soldiers bearing the cross on their tunics, attacked and stormed the largest Christian city in the world. The sack of Constantinople was an orgy of destruction and greed that lasted for 3 days. The Crusaders, who had sworn an oath to fight the enemies of Christ, turned on their fellow Christians with savage ferocity. They slaughtered civilians, defiled churches, and engaged in systematic looting on a scale not seen since the sack of Rome 8 centuries earlier. The magnificent city was stripped of its treasures. Ancient bronze statues were melted down for coin. Holy relics were stolen and shipped back to cathedrals in Venice, Paris, and Rome. The Great Library of Constantinople, with its priceless collection of ancient texts, was burned. The city that had preserved the legacy of Greece and Rome for 1,000 years was vandalized by an army of Christian zealots. The Fourth Crusade was the single greatest catastrophe in the long history of the Byzantine Empire. It was a mortal wound from which the empire would never, ever recover. The political entity was shattered. The Crusaders established a Latin empire in its place, and Byzantine nobles fled to set up rump states in exile. The city's economy was destroyed, its population scattered, its spirit broken. In 1261, the Byzantines would manage to recapture Constantinople, but the empire they restored was a ghost of its former self. It was a small, impoverished state, surrounded by powerful enemies, haunted by the memory of its own violation. The great shield of Christendom had not been broken by its enemies, it had been shattered from within by its supposed friends. The long, slow, final act of the tragedy was about to begin. The restored Byzantine Empire of the Paleologan dynasty was a shadow. It was a state living on borrowed time, clinging to the glorious memory of what it once had been. The territory was a patchwork of holdings in Greece and around the city itself. Its economy was in ruins, its trade dominated by the Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa, who treated Constantinople like their own colonial outpost. The empire was plagued by incessant civil wars, as ambitious aristocrats fought over the scraps of a dying state. All the while, a new and formidable power was rising in Anatolia, a power that would deliver the final blow. They were the Ottoman Turks. Starting as a small warrior principality on the frontiers of the Byzantine world, the Ottomans, under a series of brilliant and ruthless sultans, rapidly expanded. They were pragmatic, well-organized, and fanatically dedicated to the cause of jihad, or holy war. They bypassed Constantinople and crossed into Europe in the mid-14th century, sweeping through the Balkans. They defeated the Serbs, the Bulgarians, and even a great pan-European crusade sent to stop them. By the early 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople itself, a Christian island in a vast Ottoman sea. The city had become a place of melancholy grandeur, its population had shrunk dramatically, whole districts lay in ruins, their magnificent churches and palaces crumbling into decay, but the walls, the great Theodosian walls, still stood. They were the empire's last line of defense, a symbol of its thousand-year resistance. They had repelled more than 20 sieges, they had never been breached. In 1451, a new sultan ascended the Ottoman throne. He was only 21 years old, but he possessed a burning ambition and a will of iron. His name was Mehmed II, and from the moment he became sultan, he was obsessed with a single goal, the conquest of Constantinople. He saw it as his destiny, the fulfillment of an Islamic prophecy. He famously declared, "I must have the city, either I take the city or the city takes me." He began his preparations with meticulous, terrifying efficiency. He built a fortress on the Bosphorus to cut the city off from any potential aid from the Black Sea. And he focused on the one technology that could finally render the ancient walls obsolete: gunpowder. He hired a Hungarian cannon founder named Urban, a master of his craft who had first offered his services to the Byzantines. They could not afford his price. Mehmed could. He tasked Urban with creating the largest cannons the world had ever seen. The result was the Great Turkish Bombard, a monster of bronze nearly 30 feet long, capable of firing a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. It took 60 oxen and hundreds of men just to move it. It was the ultimate siege weapon, the death knell of the medieval fortress. In April of 1453, Mehmed's massive army, perhaps 80,000 strong, assembled before the walls of Constantinople. Inside, the last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, prepared for the end. He was a brave and tragic figure, an emperor with almost no empire to rule. He had desperately appealed to the West for help, but little came. The old wounds of 1204 ran too deep. The Pope sent a cardinal and a few hundred soldiers, but only on the condition that the Orthodox Church submit to papal authority, a move that was bitterly resisted by the city's populace. One high-ranking Byzantine official famously declared, "I would rather see the Turkish turban in the midst of the city than the Latin mitre." In the end, Constantine had only about 7,000 men to defend a 14-mile perimeter of walls. It was a hopeless task. The siege began. For 53 days, the great Ottoman cannons pounded the ancient Theodosian walls. The sound was apocalyptic, a constant, earth-shaking thunder. The defenders, under the command of the emperor and a brave Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani, fought with incredible courage. By day, the cannons would blast sections of the wall into rubble. By night, the defenders, men, women, and children, would work feverishly to build new stockades of earth and wood. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years were slowly being pulverized. Mehmed, growing impatient, executed a masterstroke of strategic genius. The Byzantines had blocked the entrance to their harbor, the Golden Horn, with a massive iron chain, preventing the Ottoman fleet from attacking the weaker sea walls. So Mehmed did the impossible. He ordered his fleet to be dragged overland. Tens of thousands of men and oxen worked through the night, building a greased log roadway over the hill of Galata. To the utter astonishment and horror of the defenders, they awoke one morning to see the Ottoman fleet sailing in their supposedly secure harbor. The city was now surrounded on all sides. The end was near. On the final night, May 28th, it was clear the final assault was coming. An eerie silence fell over the city. Inside the walls, a final, solemn Christian service was held in the Hagia Sophia. Emperor Constantine was there alongside his soldiers, Latins and Greeks, Catholics and Orthodox, united at last in the face of their common doom. He spoke to his commanders, telling them they were to die for their faith, their country, and their emperor. He then walked the walls one last time, a lonely Roman emperor inspecting the defenses of a city that had stood for over 1,100 years. At dawn on May 29th, the assault began. A human wave of Ottoman troops threw themselves at the battered walls. The defenders fought like lions, repelling wave after wave. Giustiniani, the heroic Genoese commander, was mortally wounded, a devastating blow to morale. Then disaster struck. A small postern gate, the Kirkaporta, had been left unbolted. A small group of janissaries found it, poured through, and raised the Ottoman standard on the top of a tower. At the same time, the cannons finally opened a major breach in the main wall. The elite janissaries charged in. The defense collapsed. Constantine XI, seeing that all was lost, cast off his imperial regalia. He was no longer an emperor without an empire, he was just a soldier. He raised his sword and with a handful of loyal men plunged into the thick of the fighting, into the surging tide of invaders. He was never seen again. His body was lost in the chaos of the city's fall. The last Roman emperor died a Roman soldier's death defending the city of Constantine. The second Rome had fallen. The fall of Constantinople sent a shockwave across the known world. In the capitals of Europe, it was met with horror and fear. The great bastion that had protected them for centuries was gone. For the Islamic world, it was a moment of supreme triumph, the fulfillment of a long-held dream. Sultan Mehmed, now known as the Conqueror, rode into the city. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Eastern Christendom. Dismounting, he took a handful of earth and sprinkled it over his turban as an act of humility before God. He then ordered the cathedral to be converted into a mosque. As the first call to Islamic prayer echoed through the magnificent building, 1,000 years of history came to an end. The immediate consequences were profound. The Ottoman Empire was now a dominant world power, its capital firmly planted at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. The old trade routes to the east, now controlled by the Ottomans, became more expensive and difficult for Europeans to access. This economic pressure would provide a powerful impetus for the maritime nations of the Atlantic, Portugal, and Spain, to seek new, all-water routes to the spices of India and China. In a very real sense, the fall of Constantinople helped to launch the Age of Discovery. The cultural impact was just as significant. In the years and decades leading up to the final siege, many Byzantine scholars, fearing the end, had fled to Italy. They brought with them their precious cargo, ancient Greek manuscripts, and a deep knowledge of classical literature, philosophy, and science that had been largely lost to the Latin West. This infusion of classical learning was a key ingredient in the flourishing of the Italian Renaissance. The fall of the city accelerated this exodus, creating a direct transfer of knowledge that helped to reshape the intellectual landscape of Europe. Decades after the fall, the legacy of Byzantium continued to echo. In the distant north, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, the most powerful of the Orthodox Slavic states, began to see itself as the heir to the fallen empire. Ivan the Great, the ruler of Moscow, married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. He adopted the Byzantine double-headed eagle as his symbol, and he began to promote the powerful idea of Moscow as the Third Rome. The first Rome had fallen to barbarians because of heresy. The second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen to the infidel. Now Moscow would stand as the new center of true Orthodox Christianity, a legacy that would shape the course of Russian history for centuries to come. Today, if you walk the streets of modern Istanbul, the ghosts of Byzantium are everywhere. The great Theodosian walls, though breached and battered, still snake across the landscape, a silent testament to the city's epic resistance. The Hagia Sophia, having served as a church, then a mosque, then a museum, and now a mosque again, still stands, its vast dome a masterpiece of engineering that continues to inspire awe. The legal systems of half the world owe a debt to the code compiled by Justinian. The very existence of a culturally distinct Eastern Europe, defined by Orthodox Christianity, is a direct result of the empire's enduring influence. We still live in a world profoundly shaped by this lost empire. So what can we learn from this thousand-year saga? The story of Byzantium is a powerful lesson in resilience. It shows us that survival is not about static strength, but about adaptation. The empire endured because it was willing to change, to reform its army, to innovate its technology, to use diplomacy as a weapon, and to shrink and consolidate when necessary. It constantly reinvented itself to meet the challenges of a changing world. It is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of internal division. The empire's darkest moments, the Nika riots, the disastrous civil wars after Manzikert, and above all, the catastrophic betrayal of the Fourth Crusade, were not inflicted by foreign enemies alone. They were the result of internal fractures, of political rivalry and religious schism that weakened the state from within, leaving it vulnerable to external attack. It reminds us that the most formidable walls are useless if the defenders are fighting amongst themselves. And finally, it's a story about the nature of history itself. Does an empire truly fall in a single day, Or is the final battle just the moment when a long, slow process of decay becomes irreversible? Was the end in 1453 with the roar of Mehmed's cannons? Or was it in 1204 when Christian knights sacked a Christian city, breaking its spirit and its back? Could a different choice by an emperor, a different outcome in a single battle, have changed everything? Or was the empire's final fate sealed by the great, impersonal forces of history, plague, economic change, and the relentless march of military technology? These are the questions that make history more than just a collection of dates and facts. They make it a human drama, a story of choices and consequences. So let us take one final look back at the empire that stood for 1,000 years. It was born from the ashes of one Rome and became the seed of another. It was a beacon of civilization in a dark age, a shield that protected Europe, and a library that preserved the wisdom of the ancient world. It was a place of dazzling wealth and profound piety, of brilliant diplomacy and brutal court intrigue, of sublime art and savage warfare. It was complex, it was contradictory, and it was, above all, a survivor. The story of the Byzantine Empire did not truly end when Constantine XI charged to his death. Its legacy was carried forward by the scholars who fled to Italy, by the monks who carried its faith to the Slavic world, and by the Ottoman sultans who adopted its imperial traditions and made its great city their own. What fascinates us about this story is not just its epic scale, but its deep connections to our own world. If you were intrigued by the rise of the Ottomans and the genius of Mehmed the Conqueror, the story of how his empire became a global superpower is a tale of its own. The complex relationship between the Christian West and East, which culminated in the tragedy of 1204, continues to shape religious and political dynamics to this day. And the story of Venice, the cunning maritime republic that engineered the downfall of its great rival, reveals the brutal realities of commerce and power. The echoes of Byzantium are all around us if we only know how to listen. Its light may have been extinguished in 1453, but its shadow stretches even to our own time, a long shadow of a golden empire that refused to fall.